I lived in a converted duplex for about 8 months when this happened. It was one of those old houses that had been split badly, where you could tell the original layout if you paid attention. My apartment was on the first floor. The woman upstairs was quiet most of the time except for the washing machine. For some reason I remember that part clearly because the spin cycle would make one of the light fixtures in my kitchen buzz a little. My routine was very boring. I worked at a dental office, got home around 6 most nights, took my shoes off by the door, fed myself something simple, watched half of something I wasn't really paying attention to, then showered before bed. It was a very normal apartment. Too warm in summer, kind of dusty no matter how often I cleaned. One kitchen drawer that stuck. Nothing about it felt creepy. The first thing I noticed was so small I actually forgot about it until later. I kept my spare change in a ceramic bowl next to the fridge, and one night there was a crumpled receipt tucked underneath it. Not under the edge, under the whole bowl, like someone had lifted it and set it back down on top of the paper. I remember thinking that was weird because I was pretty absent-minded, but not in that specific way. I probably would have just tossed the receipt. I stood there for a second, looking at it, then figured I must have done it while wiping the counter. A couple days later I got home, and the bathroom light was on. That bothered me more because I was very strict about lights. The electric in that place was old, and I was always turning things off. But even then, I didn't jump to anything serious. I thought maybe I'd left in a rush that morning, or maybe the switch had gotten bumped when I grabbed my towel from the shelf. I remember saying out loud, to no one, okay, in that embarrassed way you do when you're trying not to make yourself feel stupid in an empty room. Then there were little things. My shower curtain pulled farther closed than I usually left it. The kitchen chair angled slightly away from the table. Once, the chain lock on the front door was hanging down even though I knew I'd fastened it the night before. That one got to me enough that I stood there with my hand on it, trying to picture exactly what I had done. I could see myself locking the deadbolt. I could not clearly remember the chain. The most convincing explanation was the landlord. He was older, disorganized. The kind of man who acted like every unit he owned was still basically his house. He'd text without punctuation and show up to check something with almost no warning. So I told myself that was it. Maybe he'd been for some maintenance thing and forgotten to tell me. Maybe he had a worker with him. Maybe I was noticing normal stuff because I'd already made myself weird about it. I even asked him casually when I mailed rent. I wrote, "Hey, did anyone need access to my place this week?" Bathroom light was on when I got home. He replied 3 hours later, "No why." That should have settled it, but it didn't. After that, what changed was not the apartment. It was me. I started doing those little private checks people do when they don't want to admit they're scared. I took a picture of the stove knobs before leaving. I started closing the bedroom door all the way and noting where the handle sat. I put my hairbrush sideways on the bathroom counter because I knew I never left it that way naturally. I checked the chain twice before bed, sometimes 3 times. For about a week, nothing happened, long enough for me to think I'd made myself crazy. Then on a Thursday, I came home later than usual because one of the hygienists had to leave early and everything got backed up. It was just after 8. The hallway outside my apartment smelled faintly like damp concrete, which was strange because it hadn't rained. When I unlocked the door, the apartment was dark, but the air felt wrong somehow. Not cold, not warm, just used. That's the only word I have for it. Like I'd walked into a room someone had recently been standing in. The hairbrush was still sideways. The bedroom door was still shut. The stove knobs were where they should be. So I stood there feeling stupid again. Then I went to the sink for water and saw that one of the cheap magnets on my fridge had been moved a few inches. It was holding a takeout menu, and now the menu was hanging crooked over a photograph I kept there. That sounds like nothing. It still sounds like nothing when I say it out loud, but I knew I hadn't done it. I remember my stomach dropping in this very quiet, embarrassing way because it was too small to justify panic and too specific to ignore. That night I barely slept. Every sound in that place separated into layers. The refrigerator cycling on, pipes clicking, a car outside. Then around maybe 2 in the morning, I heard something I had never noticed before. Not footsteps exactly, more like a faint compressed sound above the hallway, like someone shifting their weight carefully on old wood. I didn't move. I didn't go investigate. I lay there completely still with my phone in my hand and listened so hard it made my jaw ache. It happened once, then not again. In daylight, everything looked ridiculous. My hallway ceiling had a square access panel I'd never paid attention to because it was painted over the same ugly beige as the rest of the ceiling. I assumed it led to wiring or whatever space was left between units. I got a chair, stood on it, and looked closer. There was a thin line of fresh white dust on the floor beneath it. I called the landlord, and he came over with that irritated expression people wear when they think you're about to make them do unnecessary work. He pushed the panel up with a broom handle, and a little drift of insulation came down. There was a shallow crawl space above the hall and bathroom, not tall enough to stand in. Just beams and flattened pink insulation and darkness in between. At first he said, "See? Nothing." Then he got quieter. There was an empty plastic water bottle up there, half hidden near one of the beams. Not old either. The label was still bright. There was also a dark smudge on the wood where someone's shoe might have dragged. He told me maybe it was from contractors years ago. I asked why there was no dust on the bottle. He didn't answer that right away. The police came, looked around, asked practical questions, and made the whole thing feel both more real and less solvable at the same time. They found marks near the back window frame that suggested it had been pried at some point, but not recently enough to help. The crawl space connected farther than I thought, over both units and part of the back utility area. In other words, if someone had been up there, there was no clear timeline for when they'd entered or how often. I stayed with my sister that night and never really slept in that apartment again. I went back during daylight to get clothes, and the part that bothered me most was how ordinary everything still looked. The dish towel hanging on the oven handle, the mug in the sink, my work shoes by the door. I kept thinking, if someone had been above me while I was making dinner or watching TV or showering, and there wasn't a single room in that place that had actually been private. Nothing was ever fully explained. The landlord said maybe it was a homeless person who found a way in through the rear utility access. One officer suggested maybe a previous tenant had used the crawl space for storage, and I was connecting unrelated things. Neither of those felt right. The water bottle was too fresh, and the moved objects were always just enough to notice. I still do one thing because of that apartment. If I stay anywhere alone, hotel, rental, even my own place now, I look up first. I don't know why that became the habit instead of checking under the bed like people joke about. But it did. I look at vents, access panels, drop ceilings, anything overhead. It's not because I think I'll find someone. It's because for a while I lived somewhere that taught me the space above your head can belong to somebody else without you realizing it. A few years ago, I worked opening shift at a small gym, not a chain, one of those local places that tries to look nicer than it is with gray walls and motivational quotes painted over the mirrors. I had to be there at 4:45 in the morning to turn on the front lights, start the coffee in the little member lounge, unlock the side room for the spin class instructor, and disable the alarm before the first people wandered in, pretending they liked being awake. It was never a place I found scary. If anything, it was too familiar. Rubber flooring, lemon cleaner, the same playlist every morning, the same two men stretching for half an hour without ever using a machine. The building sat at the end of a strip with a vape shop and a tax office. Boring, bright, practical. The first weird thing was the fan in Studio B. It was on when I opened, even though I always turned it off when I closed the previous afternoon. I noticed because that room had a pull chain instead of a wall switch, and the chain clicked softly against the light fixture. I stood there, looking up at it, spinning and thinking maybe the cleaning crew had used the room, but we didn't have a cleaning crew. It was just me and another girl at the desk alternating shifts, plus the owner when he felt like showing up. I texted her, "Did you come in last night?" She said no. Still, that didn't mean anything by itself. I turned the fan off and kept going. A day or two later, there was a damp footprint near the women's lockers before we'd opened. Not muddy, just the darker outline of wet shoe leaves on tile for a few seconds before it fades. I saw it while carrying towels and froze for a second, then immediately came up with explanations. Maybe I tracked it in without noticing. Maybe one of the trainers had stopped by early. Maybe there was a leak from the shower area. That's how it went for a while. Every odd thing had some stupid reasonable explanation attached to it, and because I was tired all the time, I accepted them. Then it became a pattern. The radio in the staff office would be on a different station than where I left it. One treadmill would show 2 or 3 miles logged before sunrise. A locker I knew I had latched the night before would be sitting open in the morning with nothing inside. Once there was a paper cup in the trash still cold with ice in it. That one bothered me enough that I dumped the trash out on the floor and checked. the top. The ice hadn't melted much at all. I asked the owner if he'd given anyone the alarm code besides staff. He said, "No, why?" I told him some things felt off. He had the exact reaction I hate in people. He smiled first. Not because he thought it was funny, exactly. More like he thought he already understood the whole situation, and the situation was me being dramatic. He said the building was old. The locks were old. Sometimes members got let in after hours by trainers. Maybe someone forgot to sign in. It was all very brushed off. The only reason I kept paying attention after that was because I started feeling watched in a way I couldn't justify. Not all the time, just in flashes. Walking from the front desk to the locker hallway, bending to restack yoga mats, turning off lights in the studio and seeing my own reflection in the mirror before the room went fully dark. It wasn't movie fear. It was worse in a quieter way. It felt like my body had noticed something before my mind had. One Friday, I opened the gym and found the staff office chair pulled close to the little interior window that looked toward the front desk. We never used it that way. The chair usually stayed tucked under the desk because the room was cramped. Pulled up to the window, though, it let you set it aside and look through the tinted glass into reception. I pushed the chair back and felt this cold, flat feeling go through me. Still no proof, just implication. That same morning, I went to get towels from the laundry room in the back and heard a short metallic sound from the men's shower area. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone setting a shampoo bottle down on tile. I stopped moving. The building was technically empty besides me. I said, "Hello?" Nothing. I waited a full 10 seconds, which felt much longer, then walked to the shower room entrance and looked in. All the curtain stalls were open. No one there. The floor was dry. The air smelled strongly of body spray, fresh enough that it made my eyes sting a little. I called the owner again, and this time he actually came in. He checked the bathrooms, the utility closet, the studio, the back exit. Nothing. He kept repeating that if someone had been there, the alarm would have tripped. I remember saying, unless they had the code, and he got annoyed in a way that made me feel suddenly alone in the situation. The thing that changed his attitude happened the next week. He pulled access logs from the alarm company because I wouldn't stop bringing it up. There were 3 featurings in the previous month where the system had been disarmed around 2 or 3 a.m. using the manager override, then rearmed less than an hour later. He said maybe he'd done it by accident through the app. Then he checked his phone history and got quiet. He hadn't. Only 3 people had that override. Him, his brother, and the former manager who'd quit 6 months earlier after a messy argument about payroll. According to him, the former manager's code had been deleted. The camera over the side hallway should have helped, except when we checked it, the angle had been shifted upward. Not enough to look obvious on casual glance, just enough to miss anyone passing beneath it. The cord was still plugged in. It had been physically tilted from the mount. The owner changed all the codes and locks that day. He acted serious after that, but serious in the most frustrating possible way, because now I knew I hadn't imagined it, and he still couldn't tell me who had been coming in before dawn, walking around the building, using the shower area, sitting behind the tinted office glass, looking out at the front desk. I didn't quit immediately. I probably should have, but people rarely make clean decisions when they're scared. I just started arriving 2 minutes before opening instead of early, and I would call someone while I unlocked the door so I didn't have to step inside to silence the alarm in total quiet. I lasted 3 more weeks. The last morning, the coffee maker in the lounge was already warm when I touched it. I hadn't turned it on yet. Maybe there was some mechanical explanation. Maybe it retained heat longer than I realized. Maybe the owner had come in and forgotten to mention it. I know all of that. But I also know I stood there with my hand on that plastic lid and understood very clearly that I was still not alone in that building in the way I thought I was. I left my keys on the counter that afternoon and told them I was done. What still bothers me is how normal that gym looks when I drive past it. People on ellipticals, bright windows, a little chalkboard sign outside advertising a summer membership special. If you had told me at the time to point to the exact moment something crossed from inconvenient to dangerous, I couldn't have done it. It was never one moment. It was a series of tiny permissions being taken by somebody I never saw clearly enough to name. When I was working nights at the hospital, employee parking was in a garage across the street from the main building. It wasn't far, but at 2 in the morning it felt farther than it was. You'd badge out through the side doors, cross the service road, go up 1 level in the garage, and there were rows reserved for staff with bad fluorescent lighting and a camera every so often that made you feel safer than you probably were. I had an old sedan then, nothing special and kind of messy inside. Scrubs in the back seat, empty water bottles, receipts in the console, one broken vent that clicked every time I turned left. Because the car was messy, I didn't notice the first sign right away. My seat felt slightly farther back than I usually kept it. I'm short, so I sit pretty close to the wheel, and I remember pushing the seat forward with my legs and thinking maybe maintenance had moved it when they washed the garage. Then I remembered nobody washed that garage. Still, I let it go. It had been a long shift and my feet hurt and I wanted to get home. A week later, the radio came onto a station I never used. Again, small enough to explain away. I had loaned the car to my cousin once that month. Maybe she'd changed it. Maybe I hit the button without realizing it. Then, my glove compartment was unlatched one morning when I got in after work. That made me stop. I stood in the open car looking at it, still trying not to overreact. I checked inside, insurance papers, napkins, tire gauge, nothing missing that I could tell. I sat there for a solid minute, staring at the steering wheel, because I was doing that thing where part of your brain knows the pattern before you admit it. I started locking the car with the fob, and then pulling on the handle twice to make sure. I took a picture of where I parked. I stopped leaving anything personal inside. I even vacuumed it out one Sunday afternoon, because I thought maybe if the interior was cleaner, I'd be more certain whether something had been moved. For a little while that actually helped. Nothing obvious happened. Then one rainy night, I got out of a rough shift just after 3. I was halfway across the garage when I saw my car's interior dome light switch off. Not turn on, switch off. I stopped walking. There was nobody around that I could see. Just that wet concrete smell and the sound of water dripping somewhere down a level. I told myself the light had probably been on because I hadn't shut the door hard enough when I parked. Maybe it had timed out right then. That is still technically possible, I know that, but I also know I didn't keep walking right away. I stood behind a concrete column and watched my own car for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. It's hard to say now. Nothing happened. No one got out. No door opened. Eventually I felt stupid enough that I went over there with my keys between my fingers like that was going to do anything. The doors were locked. Inside, everything looked normal except the passenger visor was down. I never used the passenger visor. I drove straight to a gas station instead of home and called security from the parking lot. The officer who met me in the morning was polite but tired. He checked the car, looked around the garage, asked if anyone else had access to my keys. I said no. He asked whether I might have forgotten and left the visor down myself. I said maybe, because by then I was already hearing how I sounded. He suggested I change, where I parked for a while. That was the kind of advice that makes you feel even less safe, because it means the person talking to you thinks something might really be happening, but doesn't have anything useful to offer. So I changed levels. Different row, closer to the stairwell, supposedly better camera coverage. For about 10 days, nothing happened. Then I came out after shift and found a folded visitor parking ticket on my driver's seat. Not from the windshield, inside the car. I can still picture it, because it was damp on one corner, like somebody had been holding it. My doors were locked, the windows were up. Nothing else seemed touched. That was the first time I felt real panic instead of dread. I backed away from the car so fast I nearly slipped. I remember looking around the garage expecting, stupidly, to see someone standing there watching me react. Security took it more seriously then. The officer who came that night checked other floors, asked for camera review, stayed with me until dawn. A couple days later, one of the maintenance guys told me quietly that there were faint tool marks along the top edge of my passenger window seal, the kind you can make using an inflatable wedge to create enough space to slip something inside and unlock the door. He said it wasn't proof exactly. Could have been old. Could have been from a locksmith years before. Could have been. The camera over my row had another problem. It wasn't dead, but it had been angled too high for weeks. You could see roofs of cars, not doors. No one knew when it shifted. No one admitted touching it. I started asking coworkers to walk with me. Then I started leaving before my shift ended if I was too tired to think clearly. Then I transferred to days. What never let me fully calm down was one detail I didn't tell many people because it made the whole story sound worse, not better. On the night with the folded ticket, my rear view mirror had been adjusted slightly downward. Not dramatically, just enough that when I sat in the driver's seat, I saw more of my own face than the back window. That is such a small thing, but to me it felt intimate in a way the other stuff didn't. A person had not just been in my car. A person had sat where I sit, touched what I touch, looked at themselves where I would look at myself, and left without taking anything. It made it feel less like theft and more like access for its own sake. Nothing conclusive ever came of it. No suspect. No clean explanation. The hospital sent a generic email months later about upgraded patrols and camera maintenance. I bought a steering wheel lock, then felt ridiculous using it inside an employee garage, then used it anyway. I still check the interior light before I approach my car at night. Not because I think it means the same thing every time. Sometimes a light is just a light. Sometimes a visor is just down. Sometimes a seat is just slightly off, and you really did forget where you put it. The problem is, once enough small things happen in a place that's supposed to be routine, routine itself stops protecting you. That's the part that stays with you. Not the proof. Not even the fear exactly. Just the understanding that there are moments when something has already crossed into your space long before you're ready to call it danger.